The 12th session began at 3:47 a.m. No one questioned the hour. In institutions like Willowbrook, time existed only as a tool of control, a currency spent in darkness, traded for silence. The room had no windows. That was documented in Report 7A, filed March 1959. Classification: redacted. The second detail, struck from official records but preserved in smuggled testimony, was simpler. She was alone. Not entirely. Dr. Elias Thorne stood behind her, white coat pristine against the rust-stained walls, his breathing steady as machinery. Two orderlies flanked the metal chair. Their names were never recorded. Disposable men for disposable work. The acid arrived in unmarked glass vials, hydrochloric. Concentration 15%, manufacturer withheld. Purpose, according to Form 334 Medical, corrective sensory stimulation for acute hysteria. The liquid caught the weak overhead light, refracting amber and gold. Beautiful, almost. Until it touched skin. Megan Harlow did not scream during the 12th burn. That detail appears in Nurse Sullivan's contraband diary, discovered 40 years later beneath floorboards in Ward D. By then, her vocal cords had learned the futility of sound. The institution swallowed screams. It digested them, converted them into silence. But before the 12th session, before the chair and the vials and the meticulous documentation of her erasure, there was Ohio. 1956. A small industrial town where chimneys coughed black smoke into perpetually gray skies. Megan was 27 then, a secretary at Hartwell & Sons Manufacturing, typing invoices with mechanical precision, her fingers stained with carbon paper and ambition's absence. She lived in a boarding house on Elm Street, 3rd floor, room facing the alley where cats fought over scraps and men relieved themselves against brick walls at 2 a.m. She was unremarkable. The records insist on this. Brown hair, average height, forgettable face. The kind of woman a city produces by the thousands, designed to blend, to serve, to disappear without ripples, until August 14th, 1956. The river behind the chemical plant ran strange that summer. Witness reports, later suppressed, described an iridescent sheen on the water's surface. Fish floated belly up in clusters. Children who played near the banks developed rashes that wouldn't heal. Megan noticed because her boarding house window overlooked that river. She noticed because she'd grown up poor enough to recognize when poison wore expensive clothes. She saw them that Tuesday evening. 3 men in suits arriving after the factory shifts ended. They spoke to the plant manager, then watched as workers drained enormous drums directly into the current. The liquid glowed faintly green under the sodium lights. Beautiful, almost. Until it touched water. Megan took notes on the back of a grocery receipt. Names she recognized from company letterheads. Times, dates. The angle of her window prevented photographs, but her secretary's memory cataloged every detail with ruthless efficiency. The anonymous letter reached the Gazette's offices on August 20th. Typed, unsigned, specific enough to be credible, vague enough to be safe, or so she believed. September 3rd, 1956, a Wednesday. Megan returned from work to find her room disturbed. Nothing stolen, that would have made sense. Instead, subtle wrongness. Her typewriter keys rearranged, papers shifted, the sensation of being studied, dissected, known. That night she woke to footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate. They stopped outside her door, waited, then moved on. The watching had begun. October brought visitors. A doctor she'd never consulted appeared at her workplace, asking pointed questions about her mental state. Her landlady mentioned concerned inquiries from officials. Colleagues avoided eye contact. Someone, somewhere, had decided Megan Harlow was inconvenient. The last entry in her personal diary, dated November 2nd, 1956, reads, "They're coming. I know they're coming. No one believes me. Maybe I am crazy." She wasn't. But by March 1957, the diagnosis was official. Acute hysteria with delusional tendencies. Commitment papers signed by 2 physicians she'd never met. Next of kin notification. waived under Emergency Psychiatric Provision 7C. On March 15, 1957, a Tuesday, Megan Harlow disappeared into Willowbrook. The last person to see her free was Mrs. Chen, the laundry woman. Years later, in depositions that would surface too late to matter, she described Megan's face. Like she already knew, like she'd accepted being erased. The institutional van arrived at dawn. No sirens, no witnesses worth remembering. By 9 a.m., the doors had closed. By noon, her name had been replaced with a number, patient 4027. Someone, somewhere, was already altering records. The medical file, declassified in 1998 under Freedom of Information Request 7734J, contains 17 pages. 12 are redacted beyond legibility. The remaining 5 tell a story written in the language of institutional erasure. Patient 4027. Female, age 28. Diagnosis: acute hysteria with delusional tendencies. The term hysteria appears 43 times in her file, a word with roots in the Greek hystera, womb, the ancient belief that women's organs wandered their bodies, causing madness. By 1957, medicine had evolved. The terminology had not. Dr. Elias Thorne's initial assessment, dated March 16, 1957, describes Megan as emotionally volatile, prone to fabricated narratives, displaying persecution complex consistent with female nervous disorders. His signature, bold, self-assured, occupies half the page. A flourish of authority, of finality. What the file omits: Dr. Thorne maintained consulting contracts with Hartwell Chemical Corporation. Compensation, $15,000 annually, 1957 equivalent. Adjusted for inflation, considerable. Adjusted for conscience, incalculable. The conspiracy emerged in fragments years later. Corporate memoranda discovered during unrelated litigation. Private correspondence between executives. A pattern so obvious it required willful blindness to miss. Memo dated August 22, 1956. Hartwell Chemical Internal Communications. Anonymous complaint to local press. Source unknown, but specificity suggests employee or resident proximity. Recommend preemptive measures. Dr. Thorne consulted. Solution identified. Solution: clinical, efficient. Megan Harlow was not a person. She was a problem requiring erasure. The psychiatric commitment process, in theory, protected the vulnerable. In practice, it required only 2 physicians' signatures and a compliant judge. No patient testimony needed. No defense permitted. The diagnosed became the silenced in a single afternoon of paperwork. Commitment order, Judge Harold Brennan, March 14, 1957. Patient presence clear and present danger to self and others. Immediate institutionalization warranted. Family notification. Unnecessary pending stabilization. Megan had no family. Her parents, textile workers both, had died in a factory fire in 1943. No siblings, no children, no husband. The state appointed itself guardian, and guardianship meant ownership. But depositions exist. Buried in boxes marked Willowbrook Closure Documentation 1987, voices persist. Testimony of Mrs. Florence Kemper, boarding house neighbor. I tried to stop them, told the men she wasn't crazy, just scared. They said it wasn't my concern. One of them, tall fellow, expensive suit. He leaned close and said, "Women like her need protection from themselves." Like that made it righteous. Testimony of Robert Chen, laundry service owner. My wife knew something was wrong. Said Megan had been asking about lawyers, about how to report crimes without getting caught. Next week, she's gone. Van came early. My wife cried for days. They disappeared her like she never existed. The phrase haunts the archived testimony. Disappeared her. Active voice, intentional. A woman rendered absence through bureaucratic alchemy. Megan understood her fate before the doors closed. Another detail from contraband sources. A letter she managed to smuggle out during her first week, intercepted by orderlies and filed as evidence of continued delusional state. To whoever finds this, I am not sick. I witnessed illegal dumping by Hartwell Chemical. I reported it anonymously. Now I am here. They will call me crazy. They will say I imagined it. But the river still glows at night. The children still have sores. I saw what I saw. If you're reading this, someone decided I was inconvenient. This is how they silence women, make us invisible by calling us unstable. The letter never reached its intended destination, the Gazette editor. Instead, it became Exhibit C in her psychiatric file, annotated by Dr. Thorne. Classic paranoid delusion. Patient believes herself victim of elaborate conspiracy. Recommendation: intensive corrective therapy. Intensive corrective therapy. The euphemisms would haunt her for 24 months. March 15th, 1957, 10:47 a.m. The institutional van wound through upstate New York, following roads that narrowed into obscurity. Megan sat between two orderlies, broad men with vacant eyes and hands that gripped too tightly when she shifted. Restraints weren't necessary. Where could she run? The van's windows were barred, the doors locked from outside. She watched the landscape change. Industrial gray gave way to rural green, then to something darker, dense woods that seemed to swallow light. The Hudson River appeared through gaps in trees, slate-colored and indifferent. Willowbrook announced itself gradually. First, the wall. Red brick 12 feet high, topped with iron spikes disguised as decorative flourishes. Then the gates, wrought iron spelling out words she couldn't read from this angle. Finally, the building itself. It rose like a monument to institutional certainty. Victorian Gothic, built 1932, expanded 1947, overcrowded by 1950. 4 stories of limestone and despair, windows small and barred, chimneys expelling smoke that smelled wrong, too chemical, too medicinal, too much like burning things that shouldn't burn. The van stopped at a side entrance. Service access. Deliveries and disposals used the same door. An orderly opened the door. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell that would define her incarceration. Disinfectant layered over human waste, mold, and something organic decomposing beneath floorboards. Out. She stepped onto gravel. The sound of it underfoot, mundane, ordinary, felt like the last normal sensation she would experience. The door behind her closed. The door ahead opened. Willowbrook inhaled. And Megan Harlow, inconvenient witness, became patient 4127. Someone in the administrative office was already typing her name into a ledger. Someone else was filing her commitment papers. A nurse prepared a uniform. Gray cotton, shapeless, designed to erase identity. Within 6 hours, she would learn that questions were prohibited, that windows didn't open, that the screams from the East Wing were part of the architecture now, ambient as ventilation hum. But first, the intake process. Strip search, delousing, inventory of personal effects, none permitted. Photographs taken. Front, profile, hands spread to show no contraband beneath nails. The camera's flash was the last light that didn't hurt. Willowbrook State School, the official designation, sanitized for public consumption, occupied 375 acres of Staten Island's northeastern corner. Records from the New York State Department of Mental Hygiene 1957 list capacity, 3,000 patients. Actual population that March, 6,214. The mathematics of overcrowding created its own horror. 2 patients per bed designed for 1. Hallways converted to dormitories, closets repurposed as isolation cells. The building breathed bodies, exhaled desperation. The architecture itself was a study in institutional cruelty disguised as efficiency. Constructed during the Depression, Willowbrook borrowed design elements from prisons and poorhouses, long corridors that amplified sound, high ceilings that made warmth impossible, windows positioned too high for patients to see outside. Only sky, only the suggestion of a world beyond. The smell announced itself in layers. First, industrial disinfectant, phenol-based, applied daily by orderlies who wore masks and moved with practiced detachment. Beneath that, human waste from overwhelmed plumbing systems. Deeper still, mold growing in walls that sweated condensation year-round. And underneath everything, permeating floorboards and ceiling tiles, the smell of neglect, of bodies unwashed, of hope decomposing. Megan's assigned ward was D7, Women's Psychiatric Observation. 3rd floor, East Wing. 42 beds in a room designed for 20. The beds themselves were metal frames with thin mattresses, sheets changed weekly if supplies permitted. Privacy did not exist. Toilets stood in the corner, doorless, used in full view of everyone. Dignity was the first casualty of admission. Her intake occurred in a windowless room lit by a single bulb that flickered with the building's electrical rhythm. A nurse, Miss Cranston, nameplate crooked, eyes professionally empty, recorded information in a leather-bound ledger. Name: Megan Harlow. Number. A pause. The conceptual shift from person to inventory. 4,127. Previous occupation: secretary. Reason for commitment. Megan opened her mouth, closed it. What answer wouldn't confirm the diagnosis already stamped across her existence? Miss Cranston didn't wait. Acute hysteria. Delusional tendencies. She wrote without looking up. Family contact. I have no family. Good. Makes transition easier. The nurse's tone suggested this was mercy, not abandonment. The uniform came next. Gray cotton, shapeless, identical to every other woman's. No pockets, contraband prevention. No buttons, suicide prevention. The fabric smelled of previous occupants, of industrial laundry soap that never quite erased human residue. Her personal clothing disappeared into a manila envelope, her name written on it in pencil. Erasable. Ward D7 operated under the supervision of Nurse Margaret Holloway, a woman whose face had hardened into permanent disapproval. She ruled with a whistle worn on a chain around her neck. 1 blast for silence, 2 for assembly, 3 for emergency lockdown. The daily schedule posted on peeling paint near the ward entrance: 6 a.m., wake 6:30 a.m., hygiene, supervised, 7 a.m., breakfast, 8 a.m., morning medication, 9 a.m., recreational therapy, 12 p.m., lunch. 1 p.m., rest period, mandatory, 3 p.m., afternoon medication, 4 p.m., occupational therapy, 6 p.m., dinner, 7 p.m., evening medication, 8 p.m., lights out. The schedule's precision was theoretical. In practice, medication came whenever staff arrived. Meals appeared cold, portions determined by whim. Therapy meant sitting in day rooms with broken furniture and magazines from 1943. But the schedule's real purpose wasn't organization. It was control. Every moment accounted for. Every action supervised. The erasure of autonomous time. Megan's first night, she lay in bed number 23, surrounded by breathing that ranged from shallow to labored. Someone wept quietly 3 beds over. Another woman muttered prayers to saints who'd stopped listening. The radiator clanked rhythmically, a mechanical heartbeat that marked time's passage without meaning. Sleep, when it came, brought no relief. The lights never fully extinguished. Overhead bulbs dimmed but never dark, casting the ward in perpetual twilight. Surveillance disguised as safety. She woke at 3 a.m. to footsteps. Heavy boots on tile. 2 orderlies moving through the ward, checking restraints on the beds near the far wall. Women tied down for nocturnal agitation. Their wrists bore marks from previous nights. The orderlies stopped at bed 31. Whispered consultation. One left, returned with a wheelchair. They lifted the occupant, a woman Megan would later learn was called Teresa, though the staff only used her number, and wheeled her toward the doors. Teresa didn't resist. Her eyes were open but empty, chemically subdued into compliance. The doors closed behind them with a sound like finality. In the morning, bed 31 was empty, stripped of linens. No explanation offered, no questions permitted. The whispers started during breakfast. Women leaned close, voices low beneath the clatter of metal trays on metal tables. Megan caught fragments. The special treatments, basement levels. The ones who go down don't come back the same. An older woman, gray hair cropped short, institutionalized face carved with lines like topographic maps of suffering, sat beside Megan. Her number was 2047. Her name, she whispered, was Ruth. You're new. Not a question. Yes. Still have your mind then. Won't last. Ruth stirred watery oatmeal without eating. They call it therapy. Different words for the same thing. What thing? Ruth's eyes met hers. In them, Megan saw something worse than madness. Clarity. Terrible, intimate knowledge. Breaking, systematic, scientific. She smiled, an expression that held no humor. Dr. Thorne runs special programs. Experimental. Government-funded, they say. Research into behavioral correction. What kind of research? The kind that needs bodies nobody will miss. Ruth stood, tray untouched. You'll find out, unless you're very lucky or very careful. She walked away, leaving Megan with questions that tasted like metal and fear. That afternoon, during recreational therapy, an hour in a day room with barred windows and a radio that played only static, Megan noticed the architecture's peculiarities. Doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Staircases leading down, secured with locks that looked newer than the building. Ventilation grates that exhaled air smelling of chemicals she couldn't identify. Willowbrook wasn't just overcrowded. It was hiding something, in the walls, in the basement, in the gaps between official documentation and whispered truth. And Teresa's empty bed remained empty. No one spoke her name again. The summons came on her 8th day, March 23, 1957, a Tuesday. Rain streaked the high windows, turning the world outside into watercolor abstractions. Nurse Holloway's whistle, 2 sharp blasts, cut through the morning medication distribution. 4th 127 report. Megan stood from her bed. Around her, 41 women suddenly found reasons to look elsewhere. The studied ignorance of institutional survival. Follow me. The corridor stretched ahead, lit by bulbs spaced too far apart, creating pools of shadow between islands of weak light. Their footsteps echoed. Holloway's efficient clicks, Megan's hesitant shuffles in slippers worn by previous feet. They descended. Not the main staircase visible from the entrance hall, but a service stair hidden behind a door marked "Maintenance Access." The temperature dropped with each step. Moisture beaded on walls that hadn't seen paint in decades. Basement level 1, then lower basement, then a level with no designation at all. The hallway here was different, cleaner, newer locks. Doors made of metal, not wood. Institutional efficiency meeting covert operation. The smell changed too. Phenol disinfectant so strong it burned the throat, masking something organic and wrong beneath. Holloway stopped at room 7B, knocked twice, waited. "Enter, Doctor." Elias Thorne's voice carried the studied calm of men who'd never been questioned. The room beyond was small, 12 feet by 12. No windows. A single examination chair dominated the center. Metal frame, leather restraints, drain beneath. Medical instruments arranged on a tray with surgical precision. Syringes, forceps, cotton swabs, and glass vials containing liquids that caught the overhead light like amber honey. "Doctor." Thorne stood beside a filing cabinet, white coat immaculate, silver hair combed back from a face that belonged on currency, strong jaw, steady eyes, the kind of face that commanded trust. He smiled. The expression never reached his eyes. "Patient 4127, please sit." Not a request. Holloway's hand on Megan's shoulder provided emphasis. The chair was cold. The leather restraints were colder. Wrist first. Left, then right, then ankles. The buckles clicked with practiced efficiency. Holloway left without being dismissed, the door closing with a sound like a coffin lid. Thorne pulled a rolling stool close. His proximity felt calculated, intimate but clinical, the closeness of examination rather than compassion. "Your file indicates persistent delusional thinking." He opened a folder, her file, pages she'd never seen. Paranoid fixations on industrial malfeasance. Belief in conspiracies targeting your person. Classic hysteria with persecution complex. "I'm not. Please, don't interrupt." His voice remained pleasant. a teacher correcting a slow student. "We're here to help you. New treatment protocols, very promising. Cutting-edge research into sensory recalibration for delusional disorders." He stood, moved to the tray, selected a vial, held it to the light. Hydrochloric acid, diluted to 15% concentration. Safe, within parameters. Applied topically, it creates a sensory shock that, theoretically, disrupts delusional neural pathways. His hands moved with the confidence of repeated practice. "You're fortunate to participate in such groundbreaking work." Megan's voice emerged smaller than intended. "I don't consent." Thorne paused, looked at her with something approaching pity. "Consent." He tested the word. "An interesting concept. But you see, you've been declared mentally incompetent. The state is your guardian, and the state, through me, has determined this treatment necessary." He soaked a cotton swab in the solution. "Consider it an opportunity. Help advance medical science, contribute to understanding." The cotton approached her forearm. She pulled against the restraints. Metal rattled, leather held. "Please, I'll stay quiet. I won't talk about..." "About what?" His voice sharpened. "About imaginary chemical dumping? About conspiracies that exist only in your fractured mind?" The swab touched skin. The pain was immediate and complete. Not heat, though it burned. Not cold, though it froze nerves into screaming awareness. The sensation of being unmade at a cellular level. Skin cells dying in real time. The body's warning systems overloading. Megan heard screaming. Distant. Realized it was her own voice. Thorne watched with clinical detachment, noting reactions in a journal. Duration, 15 seconds. Then he neutralized the area with saline, patted it dry with gauze. A blister formed, weeping clear fluid. The skin around it reddened, then began to blacken at the edges. "Excellent response, very promising." He made notes in precise handwriting. "We'll repeat this weekly. Monitor tissue degradation. Document psychological responses to repeated stimulation." He prepared a second swab. This time the inner wrist. The skin thinner there. More nerve endings. The pain found new language. Beyond words. Beyond thought. Pure sensation obliterating everything else. The session lasted 47 minutes. Documented in Report 7A, classification redacted. 7 applications total. Forearms, wrists, collarbone, behind the ear, each chosen for maximum nerve density, for optimal data collection. Between applications, Thorne spoke, his voice a constant narration of scientific justification. Pain is information, the body communicating with the mind. In your case, the communication has been corrupted. Delusions interfering with proper sensory processing. This therapy recalibrates, teaches the mind to distinguish reality from fantasy. Megan stopped responding after the third application. Not from choice, from necessity. Language required cognitive function beyond what pain permitted. Finally, Thorne set down the swab, stripped off latex gloves that smelled of acid and flesh, made final notes. "You've done well today, very cooperative considering." He smiled. "We'll continue this protocol. Weekly sessions, document progression. In time, you'll understand this was mercy. Correction through chemistry, science serving sanity." He pressed a button. Holloway returned, efficient and empty-eyed. The restraints released. Megan couldn't stand. Her legs had forgotten their purpose. 2 orderlies appeared. When had they arrived? And lifted her like cargo. The return journey blurred. Corridors, stairs, fluorescent lights that stabbed at consciousness. She registered Ward D7 only when they deposited her on bed 23. Ruth materialized. Gray hair, topographic suffering face, eyes that knew. First time. Not a question. Megan couldn't speak. Her body cataloged damage. 7 sites of chemical burn, each screaming its own dialect of agony. Her throat raw from screaming. Her mind fractured into before and after. Ruth lifted her sleeve gently. Exposed forearms cross-hatched with old scars. Acid burns healed into topographic maps of survival. Session 7. Ruth's voice carried no emotion. They call it therapy. It's training, teaching us that speaking truth costs more than silence. She produced a contraband pencil stub from inside her sock, a scrap of paper from somewhere, pressed both into Megan's trembling hand. Write it down. What they did, when they did it, names, details. Her eyes held terrible clarity. You won't believe your own memory later. The pain erases, but paper remembers. Megan's hand shook, but she wrote. Date, time, Dr. Elias Thorne, 7 applications. Hydrochloric acid, 15%. The words blurred through tears. But they existed. Evidence. Testimony. Truth written in handwriting made shaky by chemical trauma. Outside, rain continued. Inside, 42 women breathed in rhythms learned through institutional time. And in room 7B, 3 floors below, Dr. Thorne filed his report under protocols funded by men whose names would remain classified for 50 years. The first session was complete. 11 more awaited. Before Willowbrook, before the diagnosis that wasn't illness, before becoming patient 4127, there was Megan Harlow, secretary, daughter of dead textile workers, woman whose greatest crime was paying attention. The archived personnel file from Hartwell & Sons Manufacturing, discovered during a state liquidation in 1989, paints a portrait in carbon paper and time clock punches. Hired, January 7, 1952. Position, junior secretary, administrative pool. Salary, $42 weekly. Performance reviews, adequate. Attendance, exemplary. Notable infractions, none. For 5 years, she typed invoices, filed correspondence, answered telephones with the required pleasantness, became furniture, functional, unremarkable, easily replaced. The office occupied the 3rd floor of a brick building that smelled perpetually of machine oil and ambition. 23 employees, 14 men in management, 9 women in support roles. The hierarchy was architecture, men in offices with doors, women at desks in the open. Her workspace, 4th desk from the window. Close enough to natural light for eye strain prevention. Far enough that looking outside required turning away from work. The typewriter, an Underwood from 1947, had a sticky E key that required extra force. Her fingers learned to compensate. She ate lunch at her desk, brought from home, sandwiches that grew stale by noon, apples bruised from the morning commute. The other secretaries invited her occasionally to the diner across the street. She declined. Lunch cost 75 cents. Saving that accumulated into emergency funds against disasters that were always imminent for the poor. She was invisible by design, the perfect employee for witnessing what shouldn't be witnessed. August 14th, 1956. The evening Ohio became evidence. Megan worked late that Tuesday, overtime at time and a half, volunteered for because rent didn't negotiate. The office emptied by 5:30. By 7 p.m., only the cleaning woman remained, radio playing big band music that echoed through vacant spaces. Megan's boarding house window faced southwest. From the 3rd floor, she could see the Hartwell chemical plant, a subsidiary operation, technically separate, functionally integrated. The plant ran 2 shifts. Day workers departed at 4 p.m. Night workers arrived at 6 p.m., the gap between opportunity. She'd made tea, stood by the window waiting for water to boil on the hot plate forbidden by building regulations. That's when the sedan arrived. Black, late model. 3 men in suits that cost more than her monthly salary. The plant manager met them at the loading dock. Deference in his posture. The kind of bowing that happens when money speaks. They talked for 17 minutes. Megan timed it unconsciously, secretary's habit. At 7:34 p.m., workers emerged. Not regular employees, contract laborers, faces she didn't recognize. They rolled out industrial drums, 6 total. Each stenciled with symbols she later researched. Corrosive material, environmental hazard, handle with extreme caution. The drums were positioned beside the drainage canal, the canal that fed into the river that supplied downstream communities. One man supervised, pointed, gave orders she couldn't hear. The workers tilted the first drum. Liquid poured out. In the sodium light from the plant, it glowed faintly green, phosphorescent. Beautiful in the way poison often is, nature's warning disguised as attraction. The liquid hit water, spread, created an iridescent sheen that reflected the industrial lights like oil on pavement after rain. They emptied all 6 drums. Efficient. Practiced. The kind of operation repeated often enough to achieve routine. The men in suits watched, smoked cigarettes. When the drums were empty, they shook hands with the plant manager, got back in the sedan, left. The workers hosed down the area, loaded the empty drums onto a flatbed truck. By 8:15 p.m., no evidence remained except the river's new chemistry. Megan wrote it down. Her secretary training. Document everything. Names she recognized from company letterheads signed on her desk. Marcus Brennan, VP Operations. Daniel Hollister, Legal Counsel. The third man, unknown, but she described him. Tall, silver hair, scar on left cheek. The grocery receipt became a ledger of industrial crime. She folded it, placed it in her Bible, the only book she owned, inherited from her mother, rarely read but always kept. The decision to report took 3 days. Fear warred with conscience. Fear said, "You're nobody, they're powerful, silence is survival." Conscience said, "Children play by that river." August 20th, she typed the letter on her lunch break. Use the office typewriter. Underwood, sticky E. Anonymous but detailed. Dates, times, descriptions. She didn't sign it. Didn't add return address. Mailed it from a post box 6 blocks from her boarding house. The Gazette received letters constantly. Complaints, tips, conspiracy theories typed by lonely people seeking connection. Most were dismissed. But this one had specificity. Names, corporate structure, details that suggested insider knowledge. The environment editor, Thomas McKay, made inquiries. Discreet, professional. He contacted the plant, asked about waste disposal protocols, mentioned anonymous concerns. That's when the machinery of silence engaged. August 28th, corporate lawyers visited the Gazette. Friendly conversation. Concerns about libel. The economic importance of Hartwell to the community. The unreliability of anonymous sources. Perhaps, they suggested, verification before publication. McKay, to his credit, attempted verification, requested interviews, sought documentation. The plant agreed to a tour, scheduled for September 12th. Everything would be prepared. Everything would be clean. But someone somewhere wanted to know the source. Corporate security, the kind that operated without official titles, began investigating. Who had access to that view? Who worked late? Who might notice? Megan's name emerged through elimination. Secretary. Boarding house facing the plant. Overtime records showing she'd been present that evening. The decision was made in rooms where secretaries weren't permitted. The solution was elegant. Discredit the witness before she became one. September 3rd, her room was searched. Professional. Subtle. Nothing stolen, that would prompt police reports. But her papers were photographed. Her diary read. Her Bible open to the receipt pressed between Psalms. They knew. The subsequent campaign was systematic. Dr. Weston, a physician on retainer to Hartwell's insurance provider, contacted her landlady, expressed concern about a tenant showing signs of mental instability. Had she noticed unusual behavior? The landlady, Mrs. Kowalski, Polish immigrant, suspicious of authority but fearful of trouble, recalled that Megan kept to herself, didn't socialize, wrote in notebooks late at night, sometimes stood by the window for hours. Concerning, Dr. Weston agreed, perhaps requiring observation. At work, whispers started. Someone mentioned seeing her talking to herself. Someone else noticed she'd become jumpy, paranoid. The office manager suggested she take time off. Rest. Maybe see someone? October brought the formal recommendation. 2 physicians, neither of whom had examined her, signed statements. Patient exhibits delusional thinking, paranoid fixations on imaginary environmental crimes, danger to self through obsessive behavior. Megan found the commitment papers in her mailbox November 2nd. marked for next day execution. She had 12 hours. She wrote frantically that night. Letters to the Gazette, to the police, to anyone who might listen, explaining, pleading, telling truth that read like madness when isolated from context. None of the letters were mailed. She was arrested before dawn. The charges: psychiatric emergency, resisting treatment. The evidence: her own letters, now exhibits of delusional state. By noon, she was processed. By evening, she was gone. Her boarding house room was cleaned out by week's end. Her possessions, few as they were, donated to charity. Her name removed from the building's registry. Mrs. Kowalski, when questioned years later during depositions, wept. I knew something was wrong, but they were doctors, official. Who was I to question? I'm just a landlady. What do I know? She knew enough. They all knew enough. But knowing and acting occupied different moral territories. And Megan Harlow, daughter of dead workers, secretary with a sticky E key, witness to crimes rendered invisible through diagnosis, disappeared into Willowbrook, where room 7B waited, where Dr. Thorne prepared his vials, where the first corrosion was only a beginning. The chronology of pain, reconstructed from contraband documentation and forensic analysis of smuggled testimony, reveals a pattern. Not random cruelty, systematic degradation. Each session calculated, each application measured. Science serving silence. Session 2, April 2nd, 1957. Room 7B, 4:23 a.m. The hour chosen deliberately. Circadian vulnerability. Cognitive resistance at lowest ebb. Megan entered the chair with knowledge replacing ignorance. Worse, terror born from experience is more complete than fear of the unknown. Thorne introduced a variable. Sulfuric acid. Concentration, 12%. Applied to the backs of knees where skin is thinnest, nerve endings dense. The pain different from hydrochloric. Deeper, more penetrating, as if the acid sought bone. Documentation. Report. 8C. Subject displays increased resistance. Verbal pleas escalated to sustained vocalization. Restraint integrity maintained. Tissue response. Extensive blistering with secondary infection risk. Prophylactic antibiotics administered. Session duration, 52 minutes. What the report omitted. Megan begged, promised silence, offered anything except continuation. Thorne listened with clinical patience, then applied the fourth swab. She learned that day, bargaining was theater for his benefit. Evidence of breaking, documented for posterity. Session 3, April 16, 1957. Thorne expanded methodology. Combination therapy, hydrochloric and sulfuric, alternated to study comparative tissue degradation. Application sites. Fingers between digits where skin webbed, sensitive and vulnerable. Her hands, which had typed letters and held pencils and documented truth, became landscapes of chemical erosion. Blisters erupted. Skin peeled in strips. Simple grasping became agony. Ruth helped her eat that week, held the spoon, guided it to lips that trembled. Around them, 41 women pretended not to see. Survival through strategic blindness. But Ruth saw everything and remembered. Session 4, May 7th, 1957. A gap in scheduling, 3 weeks. Megan permitted herself hope. Perhaps they'd finished, data collected, purpose served. The hope itself was torture. It gave the mind something to lose. When the summons came, the betrayal of hope hurt almost as much as the acid. This session introduced duration studies. Single application, hydrochloric to the inner forearm, but sustained exposure. Thorne applied the soaked cotton, then secured it with medical tape. 15 minutes. The acid worked deeper, through dermis into subcutaneous tissue. Megan passed out at minute 11. Thorne's notes expressed frustration. Premature unconsciousness limits data collection. Recommend adjusted concentrations for future protocols. She woke in her bed. The bandage on her arm seeped fluid that smelled sweet and wrong. Infection, Ruth identified. The body rejecting itself. Session 5, May 21st, 1957. Memorial Day weekend. Outside, America celebrated veterans and barbecues. Inside Willowbrook, commemoration took different forms. Thorne tested application to mucous membranes, a cotton swab dipped in diluted acid, 8% concentration, safer parameters, touched to the inner lip. The pain was architectural, building structures of agony through every nerve pathway in her face. She bit through her tongue, trying not to scream. Blood mixed with acid, creating new chemistry in her mouth. The taste of it, metallic and chemical, became her new baseline. Food tasted like corrosion for weeks after. Sessions 6 through 9. June-August 1957. Summer brought heat and stagnation. Willowbrook's ventilation system, inadequate in winter, became torture in humidity. The smell of 6,000 unwashed bodies intensified. Megan's burns festered in the heat, resistant to the minimal medical care provided. The sessions blurred. Thorne's enthusiasm grew with each successful data point. He published, anonymously, in psychiatric journals. Novel sensory recalibration techniques for treatment-resistant hysteria. His peers praised the innovation. No one asked about methodology. Session 6. Acid applied to scalp, burning away patches of hair. Session 7. Behind the ears, the neck's nape, places that never fully healed. Session 8. The soles of feet, making walking a daily reminder of his work. Session 9. Return to the arms, layering new burns over old scars. Each session Megan documented afterward. Scraps of paper smuggled by Ruth, pencil stubs stolen from administrative offices, dates, times, concentrations when she could identify them, chemical formulas written in shaking handwriting. She hid the papers in her mattress between the ticking and the springs. An archive of atrocity, growing page by page. Session 10. September 10th, 1957. Thorne introduced witnesses. 2 men in civilian clothes, government credentials Megan glimpsed before the restraints clicked shut. They took notes, asked questions about pain tolerance, recovery periods, psychological resilience metrics. One asked, "How many applications before permanent psychological breakdown?" Thorne consulted his charts. Subject 4,127 shows unusual resistance. Average breakdown occurs session 7. She's outlasted projections. They discussed her like livestock. Asset evaluation, return on investment. The session itself tested acid exposure to breast tissue. Medical justification. Studying pain response in hormonally sensitive areas. Actual purpose. Inflicting maximum psychological trauma alongside physical. Megan stopped trying to understand the why. Acceptance replaced comprehension. This was happening. Would keep happening. Understanding served no survival purpose. Session 11. October 1st, 1957. The penultimate session lasted 4 hours. Thorne, emboldened by government interest and departmental approval, conducted what he termed comprehensive mapping. Every previous application site revisited. Fresh acid on scarred tissue. The pain transcended description. Language failed, screaming failed. Consciousness became a liability. Awareness meant experiencing every second. She fragmented that day. Part of her remained in the chair, enduring. Another part fled somewhere interior. A psychological bunker where the body's messages couldn't penetrate. Dissociation, the modern term. Survival mechanism. The mind protecting itself through strategic abandonment of the flesh. When they returned her to Ward D7, she didn't speak for 3 days. Ruth sat beside her bed, held her scarred hand, and waited. On the 4th day, Megan whispered, "Write this down." Session 11. 4 hours, government witnesses, they're testing weapons. Ruth added the note to the hidden archive. The page is now numbered 47. Evidence awaiting its moment. Session 12. October 29th, 1957. The final session. Though Megan didn't know it was final, hope remained dead from session 4. Thorne entered the room with unusual energy. "Culmination," he announced. "Synthesis of all previous data." He'd prepared a mixture, multiple acids combined. Hydrochloric, sulfuric, nitric in precise ratios. Chemist's precision serving sadist's purpose. The application was systematic. Face, neck, hands, feet, everywhere simultaneously. The pain achieved totality. No part of her remained unaware. Every nerve screaming in harmonic agony. But something else happened. Something Thorne's protocols hadn't predicted. During the 43rd minute, while Megan hovered between consciousness and escape through unconsciousness, an orderly burst through the door. Doctor, inspection, state regulators, unannounced. Thorne's face shifted. Panic quickly masked. He neutralized the acids faster than protocol demanded. Removed restraints. Injected sedatives. Get her to the ward, now, through the service elevator. The irregularity saved evidence. Rushed cleanup left traces. Vials not properly stored, notes not filed. And Megan, semi-conscious, heard him say to the orderly, "Destroy the session log." This one never happened. But it did happen. She would remember. Ruth would document. And somewhere in room 7B's haste and horror, the foundation of testimony was laid. Ruth Kaminsky, patient 2008-47, arrived at Willowbrook in 1949. 8 years before Megan. 8 years of institutional education in survival's mathematics. Her file, declassified 2001, reveals a pattern familiar to anyone who studied mid-century psychiatric abuse. Inconvenient woman, conveniently diagnosed. Original commitment reason: chronic melancholia with oppositional tendencies. Translation: she divorced her husband, a prominent surgeon, after discovering his infidelities. In 1948, women didn't divorce doctors. They were institutionalized for suggesting it. Ruth was 53 in 1957. Gray hair cropped institutional short, face mapped with lines that recorded every degradation Willowbrook offered. But her eyes remained sharp, observer's eyes, cataloger's precision. She'd survived by becoming necessary. Helped nurses with paperwork when staff shortages mounted. Mediated disputes between patients before they escalated to restraints. Made herself useful enough to be kept in minimum security wards, invisible enough to be ignored. And she watched, documented, remembered. The morning after session 12, Ruth sat beside Megan's bed, held her hand, the one less damaged, waited for consciousness to return fully. When Megan's eyes focused, Ruth spoke quietly. "You heard something yesterday, during the session." Not a question. Ruth had sources, orderlies who talked, nurses who resented Thorne's arrogance, maintenance workers who saw everything and were treated like furniture. Megan's voice emerged cracked, damaged by screaming. He said, "Destroy the log. State inspection. They won't find anything. Thorne's too careful." Ruth adjusted Megan's blanket with nurse-like efficiency. But careful people make mistakes when frightened, and he was frightened yesterday. She produced a small notebook from inside her sock, contraband refined to art form. Pages filled with cramped handwriting. Dates, names, session counts. "You're not the first, won't be the last, but you're the first who's been documenting back." Ruth's smile held no warmth, only recognition. 47 pages hidden in your mattress, I counted. Megan tried to sit up. Pain locked her spine. "How did you—" "I check everyone's hiding places. Survival means knowing everything." Ruth opened the notebook. Session records going back 3 years. 37 women. 19 died. 11 were transferred to state hospitals, which is slower dying. 7 are still here. You make 8. The arithmetic of atrocity laid bare. "Why?" Megan managed. The question encompassed everything. Why the torture? Why the silence? Why any of it? Ruth's expression hardened. Money. Government contracts. Willowbrook gets funding for advanced psychiatric research. Thorne gets grants, prestige, publications. The corporations, chemical companies, defense contractors, get data on corrosive agents' effects on human tissue without official human trials. She turned pages, showed Megan entries written in different hands, smuggled testimonies from other victims, other survivors. Patient 1847, Session 4. They tested burn treatments alongside burn induction. Wanted to know healing rates for different concentrations. Patient 3201, Session 9. Government observer asked about weaponization potential. Chemical agents for crowd control. Patient 2934, session 12. She died during the session. Report said heart failure. Autopsy was refused, family never notified. Each entry a life. Each life reduced to data points. We need more than testimonies, Megan whispered. Physical evidence, chemical samples, Thorne's actual protocols. Ruth studied her. You're thinking like someone planning testimony, someone expecting justice. Aren't you? I'm thinking like someone surviving long enough to see tomorrow. Ruth closed the notebook. But maybe it's time to think bigger. The plan formed over weeks, whispered during medication lines, refined during mandatory rest periods, coordinated through glances and subtle signals invisible to staff. Willowbrook's security was designed for keeping patients in, not for preventing internal investigation. Ruth had 8 years of mapping weaknesses. Megan had secretary skills, observation, documentation, systematic thinking. They recruited carefully. Teresa, the woman taken from bed 31 months ago, had returned changed but functional. She'd been in the sub-basement levels, seen things. She joined. Agnes, patient 3445, institutionalized for excessive religious fervor. She'd reported sexual abuse by a priest, worked laundry detail. Access to service corridors, keys copied from drunk orderlies' pockets. She joined. Mary, patient 4012, diagnosed with intellectual deficiency. Because she was deaf and doctors assumed disability meant stupidity. She lip-read conversations staff thought private. She joined. 5 women, 37 years of institutional knowledge combined. Against Thorne, his staff, and government backing. The odds were mathematical certainty of failure. They proceeded anyway. November 1957. The inspection Thorne feared passed without incident. Regulators saw clean wards, acceptable patient ratios, documentation that survived superficial examination. Willowbrook received passing grades and continued funding. But the inspection created opportunity. Thorne grew confident again. Careless. Ruth's network reported he'd resumed sessions. New patient, 4,201. Young woman, 22, committed for sexual deviancy. She'd been caught with another woman. Session 1 scheduled for November 19th. We need to access room 7B before then, Megan said. Document everything. Impossible, it's locked. Guarded during sessions, and Thorne keeps the only key. Agnes, quiet until then, spoke in Polish-accented English. Not only key. Maintenance has master. For emergencies. Can you get it? Can try. Victor, the night janitor, he drinks. Falls asleep in boiler room around 2 a.m. The plan solidified. November 17th, Sunday. Minimal staff. Agnes would acquire the key. Mary would watch for guards. Her deafness meant she felt vibrations in the floor, could sense approaching footsteps before hearing people could. Teresa knew the route to the sub-basement. Ruth would document. Megan would photograph. A Brownie camera smuggled from a visitor's bag months prior, film hoarded like currency. Risk, catastrophic. Discovery meant isolation cells, increased medication, possibly lobotomy for ringleaders. But patient 4201 was 22. Her whole life ahead. Maybe preventable torture justified catastrophic risk. November 17th, 1:47 a.m. They moved. Agnes delivered the key, hands shaking. Mary took point position. Teresa guided them through service corridors she'd memorized during her own trauma. Ruth carried the notebook. Megan held the camera. The descent into the sub-basement felt like entering Earth itself. Temperature dropping, humidity rising, the smell of chemicals intensifying. Room 7B's door was unmarked. Institutional anonymity hiding institutional crime. The key turned. The door opened. Inside, their worst confirmations. Filing cabinets filled with patient records. Session logs dating back to 1954. 37 folders. Each a woman. Each a research subject. Megan photographed pages. Her hands steady now, purpose overriding fear. Click, advance, 12 photographs before the film ran out. Ruth transcribed frantically. chemical formulas, concentration charts, government contract numbers, Defense Department requisition forms. Teresa found vials labeled with corporate logos: Hartwell Chemical, DuPont, Monsanto. The companies weren't abstract anymore. They had names. Agnes discovered the prize: Thorne's personal journal. Unguarded thoughts written in margins. Subject 2934's death regrettable, but data invaluable. Tissue samples sent to Fort Detrick for weapons analysis. Weapons, not medicine. Weapons. 23 minutes in the room. Then Mary's hand signal, vibrations. Someone coming. They fled. Reverse route. Stairs climbed in controlled panic. Corridors navigated by memorized counting. Back toward D7. The key returned to Victor's ring before he woke. Evidence secured in 49 photographs and 30 pages of transcribed horror. But Discovery's risk hadn't passed. Thorne would notice things displaced, files touched. Investigation would follow. "We need to leave," Megan said. "Soon, before he realizes." Ruth nodded. "Escape requires outside help. Someone who'll believe us, who has power to act." "Who?" The question hung. Then Mary, whose lip reading made her expert in staff gossip, signed rapidly. Ruth translated. "There's a reporter. Keeps trying to get inside. State senator's daughter was committed here last year. He doesn't believe the diagnosis. His name, James Whitmore. Credentials, investigative journalist, Albany Times. Motivation, personal and professional." "How do we reach him?" Megan asked. Agnes smiled. "Laundry goes to outside service. I include letter in next shipment. Tuesday. 3 days. 72 hours to wait. To hide evidence. To pray Thorne's investigation didn't find them first." Outside, November rain began. Inside, 5 women who'd been rendered invisible plotted their own exhumation. The ally in the shadows had become allies plural, and evidence finally existed beyond testimony. The letter reached James Whitmore on November 21, 1957, buried in a laundry shipment, wrapped in a pillowcase that smelled of institutional disinfectant and desperation. His hands shook reading it. Not from cold, from recognition that everything he'd suspected about his sister's commitment was confirmation written in 5 different hands. "We are 37. 19 are dead. We have evidence. Government contracts, chemical weapons testing. Women used as research subjects. Help us. Please. We are running out of time." Attached, 3 photographs smuggled from the laundry bundle. Blurry but legible. Session logs, chemical formulas. A page from Thorne's journal with Fort Detrick mentioned explicitly. Whitmore was 43, veteran journalist, covered Korea, then McCarthy hearings. He knew institutional cover-ups, knew how power protected itself, knew that 5 women in an asylum had approximately 0 credibility against a decorated psychiatrist with government funding. But he also knew his sister hadn't been delusional. She'd been inconvenient, caught her husband embezzling from his firm, threatened to report it. 2 weeks later, committed. Classic pattern. He made calls, careful ones. A lawyer he trusted. A state inspector he'd worked with on previous exposés. Both agreed. Getting patients out required either family requests or court orders. Neither woman had family willing to challenge commitments. The third option was illegal, dangerous, and possibly their only chance. Extraction. November 26, 1957. Thanksgiving Eve. Willowbrook operated on skeleton staff. Holiday coverage meant minimum security, maximum opportunity. Whitmore arrived at 11:47 p.m. service entrance. Agnes's contact, Victor the janitor, paid 3 months' salary for 30 minutes of looking elsewhere. The 5 women waited in a storage room adjacent to the laundry. Each carried nothing. Possessions would raise alarms. Only the evidence, photographs hidden in undergarments, notebook pages sewn into hems, Thorne's journal pages memorized and transcribed. Megan saw Whitmore and felt the surrealness of rescue. After 8 months of institutional time, Freedom looked like a stranger in a rain-soaked coat offering his hand. "Can you walk?" His voice, accustomed to interviews and interrogations, softened at their visible damage. They could. Pain was familiar. Pain they could navigate. Hope was newer, more disorienting. The van waited behind the building, industrial, unmarked. Inside, blankets, coffee and thermoses, medical supplies. Whitmore had planned. They moved through corridors mapped by 8 years of Ruth's observation. Stairs descended carefully. Doors opened with Victor's keys. The night air hit them like baptism. Cold, clean, free. Agnes went first. Then Teresa. Mary. Ruth hesitated at the van door, looking back at the building that had contained her since 1949. 8 years, she whispered. "Thought I'd die here." "You almost did," Whitmore said gently. "Now you testify." Megan climbed in last. Turned. Saw Willowbrook's silhouette against the November sky. 4 stories of institutional brutality disguised as healthcare. Inside, 6,000 patients still trapped, including the women they couldn't save. The guilt of leaving tasted like the acid she'd learned to endure. The van pulled away at 12:34 a.m., November 27, 1957. Behind them, Victor reset locks, erased footprints from his rounds log, and tried to forget what he'd enabled. By morning, 5 beds would be discovered empty. Investigation would follow, but by then, the evidence would already be elsewhere. The safe house was Whitmore's brother's hunting cabin. Upstate, remote. No electricity, no phones, no official existence. Heat from a wood stove, water from a well. Isolation that felt like luxury after institutional crowding. They arrived at 3 a.m., collapsed into sleep that came without medication for the first time in collective years. Megan woke at noon, sunlight through windows without bars. The silence wrong because it wasn't institutional. No medication carts, no whistles, no screaming from adjacent wards. Ruth was already awake, organizing evidence on a table. Photographs arranged chronologically. Notebook entries cross-referenced. The beginnings of testimony structure. "We have 3 days," she said without preamble. Then Whitmore files the story. "We need our statements clear, consistent, documented." The next 72 hours became reconstruction. Each woman writing her experience. Dates, details, Thorne's words, the government observers, the chemical company's logos on vials. Megan's statement ran 47 pages. Handwritten because typewriters triggered institutional memories. Each session described. Each pain cataloged. Not for sympathy, for evidence. Whitmore interviewed them separately. Journalists' methodology ensuring independent corroboration. The consistency stunned him. Details matched across testimonies. Dates aligned. Even chemical formulas described by women with no scientific training corresponded to military research documents he'd obtained through sources. November 30th, the Albany Times ran the front page. "Asylum horror, government-funded experiments on women patients." The response was immediate and predictable. Willowbrook administration denied everything. Thorne's lawyers issued defamation warnings. State officials promised investigation while privately pressuring the Times to retract. But Whitmore had learned from McCarthy. Once the story breaks, denial becomes confirmation. He released photographs, published excerpts from Thorne's journal, named the corporations. Public outrage built slowly, then avalanched. Women's groups protested. Veterans organizations remembering their own institutional abuses joined. The ACLU filed suit. December brought subpoenas. Federal investigators, different from those who'd funded Thorne, arrived at Willowbrook. Audit trails were examined, patients interviewed, evidence excavated. But escape's price wasn't paid only in testimony. Megan lived in the cabin through winter. The isolation she'd craved in Willowbrook became new torture. Too much silence, too much freedom, too much time remembering. Her body healed slowly. The burns scarred. Some scars infected despite treatment. The one behind her ear never properly closed. Weeping fluid that smelled chemical. But physical healing was straightforward compared to psychological aftermath. Nightmares came nightly, not metaphorical. Actual sleep disrupted by Room 7B's return. She'd wake screaming, convinced restraints still held her wrists. Ruth, sleeping in the adjacent room, would come running, hold her hand, wait for reality to reassert itself. "It's real," Megan would whisper. "This is real. I'm out." "Yes," Ruth confirmed. Every night, as many times as needed. January 1958 brought the first trial date. Thorne and 3 administrators charged with assault, unlawful imprisonment, conducting medical experiments without consent. Federal charges pending. The prosecution requested victim testimony. All 5 women would need to appear, relive the sessions publicly, face Thorne across a courtroom. "I can't," Teresa said. The strongest of them, survivor of the worst. She broke at the thought. "Put me back in that room with him, even metaphorically. I can't." But they would, because testimony was the only weapon they had against institutional power. The defense strategy was predictable: discredit the witnesses. These were committed psychiatric patients, delusional, unreliable, seeking attention or revenge against doctors who tried helping them. Megan's diagnosis, acute hysteria with delusional tendencies, became the defense's foundation. If she was crazy enough to commit, she was crazy enough to fabricate torture. The circularity was perfect. The system that enabled abuse now provided Thorne's protection. February 12, 1958. Pre-trial hearing. Megan testified for 6 hours, described each session, showed scars, remained composed under cross-examination that tried painting her as vindictive fantasist. The defense attorney, Marcus Brennan, formerly VP Operations at Hartwell Chemical, asked, "Isn't it true you harbored grudges against chemical companies? That your commitment resulted from delusional accusations against your former employer?" The connection clicked. Brennan wasn't random. He was cleanup. Corporate protection extending to criminal defense. "My accusations weren't delusional," Megan replied. "They were documented. And 12 sessions of acid torture don't make them less true." The judge, a woman, importantly, sustained the objection, but the jury had heard it. Outside the courtroom, Whitmore approached. "They're threatening the story. Pressure from above. Federal contracts, national security concerns. They want this quiet." "Can they succeed?" Ruth asked. "They can try, but the evidence is already public. Photographs published. Testimonies recorded. Even if the trial ends badly, the truth's documented." "Not enough," Megan said. "We need convictions. Otherwise, it happens again. Different asylum, different doctor, same horror." The trial would determine whether institutional violence could be prosecuted or whether power remained untouchable. But regardless of verdict, Megan understood something fundamental. Escape wasn't ending. It was beginning. The escape from Willowbrook took one night. The escape from what Willowbrook did would take the rest of her life. Every morning she touched the scars, remembered, refused to let remembering destroy her. The silence after escape was different from institutional silence. Not imposed, chosen. She spoke when testimony required. Otherwise, she kept the pain private, not from shame, from preservation. Some horrors survived, became armor. Others remained wounds requiring daily tending. Megan learned to distinguish between them, and waited for the verdict that would tell her whether survival meant anything beyond personal endurance. The State of New York versus Dr. Elias Thorne et al. Commenced March 3, 1958. Albany County Courthouse. Courtroom C capacity, 200. Attendance that first day, 347, with overflow crowds filling hallways. The defendants sat in tailored suits that cost more than most patients' annual care budgets. Dr. Elias Thorne, 52, silver-haired authority incarnate. Administrator Harold Brennan, 48, institutional bureaucracy personified. Chief Orderly Marcus Doyle, 39, violence's faithful instrument. Nurse Supervisor Catherine Holloway, 44, complicity in starched white. 4 people, 37 victims, 19 dead. The mathematics didn't balance. Judge Marion Hartwell, no relation to Hartwell Chemical she'd confirmed 3 times, presided with granite composure. first woman appointed to Albany's Superior Court, 1955. She understood intimately how institutions treated inconvenient women. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Robert Sanderson, opened with medical testimony. Dr. Leonard Shaw, independent forensic pathologist, examined Megan's scars under courtroom lights. These burns are consistent with repeated chemical exposure, hydrochloric and sulfuric acids based on scarring patterns. Application was deliberate, precise locations, controlled concentrations. Not accidental, not self-inflicted. Methodical. Defense objection. Speculation regarding intent. Judge Hartwell. Overruled. The witness may characterize wound patterns. Shaw continued. I've examined all 5 plaintiffs. Collective total. 143 distinct chemical burn scars. Some healed, some actively suppurating. Ages of wounds match the timeline provided in testimony. This wasn't isolated incident. This was protocol. The defense's cross-examination tried undermining credibility. Doctor, isn't it possible these women injured themselves? Psychiatric patients often engage in self-harm. Not like this. Shaw's voice carried professional certainty. Self-inflicted burns are typically accessible areas. Forearms, visible skin. These burns include scalp, back of knees, areas requiring assistance to reach. The precision indicates external application by trained hands. Day 2 brought documentary evidence. Whitmore's photographs projected onto courtroom walls. Session logs enlarged until Thorne's handwriting filled the space. Chemical formulas that defense experts couldn't explain away. Exhibit 23A, Thorne's personal journal entry dated May 7, 1957. Subject 4127 demonstrates remarkable pain tolerance, extended exposure duration to 15 minutes, tissue degradation extensive, but subject maintained consciousness. Data forwarded to Fort Detrick as requested. Application for continued funding submitted. Fort Detrick, U.S. Army Medical Research Institute, Chemical and Biological Weapons Division. The courtroom went silent. Even defense attorneys paused, recalculating strategies. Sanderson pressed the advantage. Dr. Thorne accepted $127,000 in federal contracts between 1954 and 1957. Those funds came from defense budgets allocated for chemical weapons research. He wasn't conducting psychiatric therapy. He was conducting human weapons testing under medical disguise. Defense objection. Prejudicial characterization. Judge Hartwell. Sustained. Jury will disregard the characterization, but the financial records stand as evidence. Day 5 brought victim testimony. Ruth First. 8 years institutionalized gave her narrative authority. She described the systematic nature, how women were selected, how sessions were scheduled, how silence was enforced through medication and isolation. They chose women with no families, no advocates. Women's society had already erased. Her voice steady, eyes fixed on the jury. We were convenient, disposable, the perfect research subjects. Agnes testified in accented English about the procurement system, how chemicals arrived monthly from corporate suppliers, how disposal protocols violated every safety regulation, how staff who questioned were transferred or fired. Teresa described the basement levels, the rooms beyond 7B where other experiments occurred, radiation exposure studies, psychotropic drug trials, surgical procedures without anesthesia or consent. Each testimony built the pattern. Individual horror accumulated into systemic atrocity. Then Megan took the stand. 6 hours across 2 days. She recounted every session, dates, times, chemicals used, Thorne's words, the government observers, the corporate logos on vials. Her voice never wavered. Couldn't afford to. Emotional testimony would be dismissed as hysteria. Clinical recitation was harder to dismiss. The defense's cross-examination was brutal. They painted her as vengeful, delusional, attention-seeking, reminded the jury of her original diagnosis. You were committed for acute hysteria and delusional thinking, correct? I was committed because I witnessed industrial crimes and reported them. That's your belief. But doctors, trained professionals, diagnosed you as mentally unstable. Those same professionals tortured me for 8 months. Perhaps their judgment isn't reliable. The gallery erupted. Judge Hartwell's gavel restored order. But the exchange had shifted something. The jury, 7 women, 5 men, looked at Megan differently, not as patient. As witness, Week 3 brought defense testimony. Thorne took the stand with professorial confidence, described his research as innovative therapeutic intervention for treatment-resistant disorders. These women came to me broken, delusional, unable to function. My protocols, though unconventional, aimed at neurological reset through controlled sensory stimulus. Controlled sensory stimulus, Sanderson repeated during cross. You mean chemical burns? I mean therapeutic application of dermatological stressors to recalibrate dysfunctional neural pathways. 19 women died during or after your recalibration. How do you explain that? Thorne's composure cracked microscopically. Psychiatric institutions house vulnerable populations. Mortality rates are naturally elevated. Naturally elevated. Patient 2009-34 died during session 12. Autopsy was refused. Her family never notified. Natural? I followed all institutional protocols. Protocols you designed. Protocols you enforced. Protocols that sent tissue samples to weapons facilities. The defense objected repeatedly. Judge Hartwell sustained some, overruled others. But damage accumulated. Expert witnesses for the defense tried framing the research as legitimate. Experimental, yes, but within medical ethics of the era. The Nuremberg Code, establishing informed consent requirements, was only adopted in 1947. Standards were still evolving. Sanderson's rebuttal was simple. The Nuremberg Code exists because of Nazi medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. Are we really arguing that 12 years later, similar experiments on American women are acceptable because ethics are evolving? The jury deliberated for 6 days. National attention focused on Albany. Women's groups rallied outside the courthouse. Medical associations watched nervously. Defense contractors held their breath. April 14, 1958. Verdict day. Count 1. Assault with intent to inflict great bodily harm. Guilty. Count 2. Unlawful imprisonment. Guilty. Count 3. Conducting medical experiments without consent. Guilty. Count 4. Conspiracy to commit the above. Guilty. All 4 defendants. All counts. The courtroom exploded. Megan felt Ruth's hand grip hers. Felt tears she hadn't permitted herself until this moment. Felt something almost like vindication, though vindication couldn't erase scars. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Judge Hartwell's statement was brief and devastating. The defendants exploited institutional authority to inflict calculated suffering on vulnerable women. They transformed medical facilities into laboratories of torture. They hid behind scientific language to justify crimes against humanity. This court finds their actions reprehensible, their justifications hollow, and their punishment warranted. Dr. Elias Thorne. Life imprisonment without parole. Harold Brennan. Life imprisonment without parole. Marcus Doyle. 35 years. Catherine Holloway. 25 years. But justice's machinery moved slower than trauma's consequences. Thorne committed suicide in prison, July 1958. Hanging. Note left behind blamed political persecution. Brennan died 3 months later, killed by another inmate. Official report, altercation over gambling debts. Unofficial whispers, silenced before he could implicate corporate sponsors. The conviction stood, but questions remained. How many others participated? How many facilities operated similar programs? How much institutional horror remained hidden? The trial ended the visible crimes. The invisible ones continued in shadows, waiting for their own exposure. Willowbrook State School closed its doors permanently on September 17, 1987. 30 years after Megan Harlow became patient, 4,127. 30 years after the first burn. The official closure followed Geraldo Rivera's exposé. Hidden cameras revealing conditions that shocked even a nation accustomed to institutional negligence. overcrowding, abuse, neglect. The same patterns Megan had documented in 1957, still operating 3 decades later. Some institutions don't reform. They simply metastasize. The building stands empty now, abandoned, windows broken, graffiti covering walls where screams once echoed. Urban explorers occasionally breach the fence, posting photographs online. They caption them creepy or haunted, treating trauma's architecture as entertainment. They don't know what the basement held. The records were sealed, classified. National security, they said. Some truths remain too dangerous for full disclosure. Megan Harlow lived until 2003, 74 years old. The scars outlasted her. The last one, the burn behind her ear that never fully healed, wept until the day she died. She never married, never had children, not from inability but from choice. Trauma doesn't always prevent futures. Sometimes it clarifies them. Megan chose solitude not as wound but as preference. Silence on her terms, not institutionally imposed. She became a paralegal, specialized in patient rights advocacy, helped draft the Mental Health Patients' Bill of Rights, enacted in New York in 1973. Her testimony before the state legislature was characteristically precise. Dates, cases, failures, solutions. No one who heard her speak forgot it. The scars visible on her arms provided punctuation to every argument about institutional accountability. She corresponded with Ruth until Ruth's death in 1992. Letters weekly, then monthly, then sporadically as arthritis made writing difficult. The letters discussed ordinary things: weather, gardens, books read, never Willowbrook. That lived in silence between them, requiring no language. When Ruth died, Megan attended the funeral. Small gathering in upstate New York. Former patients, scattered survivors of Willowbrook's various eras. They recognized each other through institutional posture. The way they held themselves, the way they watched doors, the way silence settled differently around them. No one asked, "How are you?" They knew. Survival wasn't recovery. It was daily negotiation with memories that never fully left. The legal aftermath of the trial rippled outward. Congressional hearings in 1959 investigated psychiatric institutions nationwide. Similar programs were discovered at 14 facilities. Different doctors, same protocols. Chemical experiments, radiation studies, psychosurgery without consent. The Willowbrook trial became precedent. Informed consent requirements strengthened. Institutional oversight increased. Patient advocacy organizations formed. Laws changed. But laws change slower than suffering accumulates. Teresa killed herself in 1961. Overdose. Her suicide note brief read, "I survived the sessions. I didn't survive the survival." Agnes returned to Poland in 1965. Wanted to die where she was born, she said. Away from American institutions, American experiments, American justice that came too late. Mary lived longest of the 5 who escaped. Died 2008, age 83. In interviews near the end, she described Willowbrook as the thing that defined me, but didn't defeat me. The distinction mattered to her. Only Megan gave extensive testimony to historians. Tape-recorded interviews conducted 1985 to 1998, archived at Columbia University. 47 hours of recollection. Each session, the word choice unfortunate but unavoidable, lasting precisely 1 hour before she stopped. "That's enough remembering for today," she'd say. Always the same phrase. The interviewers learned not to press. In those recordings, her voice carries no self-pity, no dramatic emphasis. She recounts horror with secretary's precision, cataloging atrocity like filing documents. Only occasionally, when describing Ruth's help or the moment of escape or Teresa's suicide, does her voice break. "People ask if I've forgiven them," she says in the final recording, October 1998. Wrong question. Forgiveness implies they sought it. They didn't. Thorne died believing he was persecuted for advancing science. Brennan's last words blamed corporate betrayal, not conscience. They never acknowledged wrong. How do you forgive what won't admit guilt? She pauses. The tape record's silence. Better question. Have I forgiven myself for surviving? For leaving women behind? For not exposing it sooner? Another pause. Some days, yes. Most days, no. Survival came with costs I'm still paying. The women who never escaped haunt different archives now. Death certificates filed incorrectly. Burial plots marked with numbers, not names. Patient 1847, patient 2934, patient 3201. Families were told their daughters, wives, sisters died of natural causes. Heart failure, pneumonia, complications of mental illness. The death certificates were signed by institutional physicians whose signatures appear on hundreds of similar documents. No one investigated. The dead were already disappeared. Mortality just formalized their erasure. In 2011, a memorial was erected outside the former Willowbrook grounds. Small granite marker. Tasteful. Vague. In memory of those who suffered here. 1932-1987. No names. No specifics. No mention of experiments, torture, systematic abuse. Just suffering, passive voice, as if it happened without human agency. Survivors' advocates protested the inscription's inadequacy, demanded truth-telling, demanded accountability extending beyond 4 convictions. The marker remained unchanged. Truth, apparently, required more space than granite permitted. This document, compiled from declassified archives, smuggled testimony, forensic analysis, and survivor interviews, represents partial truth. Partial because some records remained sealed. Partial because some voices were silenced permanently. Partial because institutions protect themselves long after individuals die. How many more Megans exist in unexamined archives? How many facilities operated similar programs? How many women bore witness to crimes, only to be diagnosed insane for their clarity? The questions persist because the patterns persist. Different forms, same foundations. Institutional power over vulnerable populations. Medical authority weaponized against the powerless. Silence enforced through diagnostic labels. 2025, and still, women reporting assault are questioned about mental stability. Whistleblowers are pathologized. Witnesses are discredited through psychiatric diagnoses. The machinery Thorne used, diagnosis as weapon, institution as silencer, still operates. Willowbrook is closed, but its descendants operate under different names, different justifications, same essential logic. Some people's voices matter less. Some people's pain is acceptable research cost. Some people are disposable. Megan knew this. Her advocacy work targeted systems, not individuals. Laws, not personalities. She understood that Thorne was symptom, not disease. The disease was institutional impunity. That disease remains undefeated. Her final interview question, posed by a graduate student in 1998. What do you want people to remember about Willowbrook? Megan considers. The tape records her breathing, slightly labored. She's 69. The scars ache in cold weather. Memory requires physical endurance now. Remember that it happened, that institutions we trusted committed crimes against vulnerable people, that medical language disguised torture, that women's voices were systematically dismissed as madness. Pause. But also remember we resisted. We documented. We escaped. We testified. We survived. And remember the ones who didn't survive. Speak their numbers since their names are lost. Patient 1847. Patient 2934. All 37. They're why the story matters. Not for pity, not for horror's sake, but because forgetting guarantees repetition. Memory is prevention. Remember us. Remember them. Remember that it can happen again if we stop watching. The tape ends there. Static hiss, then silence. Megan Harlow died 5 years later, February 2003. Cremation. No religious service. She'd had enough of institutions promising salvation. Her ashes scattered in the Hudson River, miles upstream from Willowbrook. The river flows past the institution's ruins, past the basement where room 7B still exists behind locked doors, past the unmarked graves where 19 women rest without names. Water carries memory differently than stone. It flows, spreads, reaches places monuments cannot. And somewhere in the archives, in boxes marked declassified, in folders yellowed with bureaucratic neglect, the evidence remains, waiting for the next researcher, the next whistleblower, the next woman who refuses to be silenced. The ashes still burn. Memory resists erasure. Truth, buried, grows like roots through concrete, slow, persistent, ultimately unstoppable. Willowbrook tried to erase them. Diagnosis tried to silence them. Authority tried to dismiss them. Death claimed some. Time claimed others. But the women who never returned are remembered. This document ensures it. Their voices echo through declassified pages, demanding, bear witness, investigate further, prevent recurrence, remember always. The trial convicted 4 people, but the verdict belongs to 37 women who transformed their suffering into testimony, their silence into evidence, their invisibility into historical record. Justice, when it comes at all, comes too late. But it comes, and memory, preserved, becomes justice's foundation. In a world that tried to erase them, women who never returned remembers.